First, former Justice Department officials during Trump administration say they faced a relentless pressure campaign from the former president to help him overturn the 2020 election. Jeffrey Rosen, Richard Donoghue, and Stephen Engel testified Thursday before the January 6th committee. This was the 5th public hearing the panel has held so far. Meanwhile, federal agents raided the home of Jeffrey Clark, a Trump administration official who supported the former president's efforts. Nikole Killion is on Capitol Hill with the latest.
This appears to be another case of the former president ignoring advice from his own administration as he tried to pressure senior Justice Department officials to overturn the 2020 election.
Between December 23rd and January 3rd, the president either called me or met with me virtually every day.
Testifying under oath, top former Department of Justice officials told the House Select Committee investigating the January 6th attack that former President Trump relentlessly pressured them to investigate false claims of election fraud.
We had concluded, based on actual investigations, actual witness interviews, actual reviews of documents, that these allegations simply had no merit.
Weaving previous interviews with live testimony, committee members painted a picture of a desperate president attempting to force former acting Attorney General Jeffrey Rosen and his deputies to cast doubt on election integrity.
You also noted that Mr. Rosen said to Mr. Trump, quote, DOJ can't and won't snap its fingers and change the outcome of the election. How did the president respond to that, sir?
He responded very quickly and said, essentially, that's not what I'm asking you to do. What I'm just asking you to do is just say it was corrupt and leave the rest to me and the Republican congressman.
Instead, Jeffrey Clark, an environmental lawyer at DOJ with no experience in elections, wrote a draft letter that he intended to send to battleground states Trump lost, saying the department had identified significant concerns that may impact the outcome of the election. That was false. 3 days before the January 6th attack on the Capitol, a tense hours-long Oval Office meeting took place where Trump threatened to replace Rosen with Clark.
Toward the end of the meeting, the president, again, was getting very agitated, and he said, people tell me I should just get rid of both of you. I should just remove you and make a change in leadership, put Jeff Clark in, maybe something will finally get done.
Also at that meeting, Stephen Engel and former acting Deputy Attorney General Richard Donoghue. They helped knock down claims of voter fraud and told the former president they had hundreds of attorneys at DOJ who would resign immediately if he went through with his plan. Only then, Donoghue said, Trump backed off.
And I began to explain to him what he had to lose, and what the country had to lose, and what the department had to lose. And this was not in anyone's best interest.
Jeffrey Clark did not testify at the hearing, but invoked the Fifth Amendment at a previous deposition. And Wednesday, federal investigators raided his Northern Virginia home. Meantime, the committee named more Republican lawmakers who sought pardons after meeting with the former president to strategize ways to try to block the certification of the election. Jamie?
Nikole Killion, thank you for your reporting. For more, I want to bring in CBS News Chief Washington Correspondent Major Garrett and CBS News Senior Investigative Correspondent Catherine Herridge. Thank you both so much for joining us. I want to start with Catherine, though. Catherine, right at the end there, Nikole was talking about federal agents raiding Jeffrey Clark's home. What do we know about that raid? And due to your reporting, I saw earlier, there's some questions about the timing of it.
Mm-hmm. Well, Jamie, based on our reporting here at CBS Washington, we were able to confirm through a spokesman for Jeffrey Clark that about a dozen federal officials raided his home in Northern Virginia early Wednesday morning and that they seized electronic devices. In my experience, federal investigators seize electronic devices because they're trying to understand who the individual was communicating with, and they also want to see how many iterations or versions of a document existed, and that could be especially important with Jeffrey Clark. He drafted this letter that he suggested be sent to senior Georgia state officials about the outcome of the election, casting doubt on the results and calling for the suspension of proceedings and even the selection of alternate electors. Those close to Clark said to me that they were really questioning the timing, how this seemed to roll out within 24 hours of the January 6th committee hearing, where the focus was squarely on Justice Department officials and especially Jeffrey Clark. Jamie.
Do they think that they were trying to pressure him into maybe changing his mind on pleading the Fifth?
I don't want to offer speculation on that. I just point to the data points here. We have a raid on a former senior Justice Department official. That in itself is unusual and significant. And at the same time, we've had a number of subpoenas roll out to individuals who agreed to be these electors for President Trump. So this all speaks to the expansion of the investigation, but the timing is quite neat, if you don't say so.
Right. Well, Major, we also heard from Jeffrey Rosen about Trump's efforts to try and get the Justice Department to seize voting machines. We learned a lot from his testimony. Can you break down what else we heard today?
Sure, Jamie, and let's just pause for a moment to absorb what you just said and what was in the testimony today. The President of the United States, long after every state in this country had certified its electoral votes in the just concluded presidential election, in the Oval Office, said out loud, why don't you just seize the voting machines? Right. And then asked a leading figure of the Department of Justice why he wasn't doing that. And then being told by this leading figure, his acting Attorney General, Jeff Rosen, that that's not a Department of Justice duty and there's no legal basis for it, said, well, what about Department of Homeland Security? Then he asked to have the second in command there to seize voting machines. There is no federal authority in any department, Jamie, to seize voting machines for a couple of really important reasons. One, states run elections in this country. Why do we know that? Because the Constitution says so. So the president was talking about doing something manifestly unconstitutional to have the federal government seize voting machines. Secondly, the Justice Department has a long-standing policy, which for this election period was transgressed. What is that long-standing policy? To stay out of any disagreements about election results and leave that to the campaigns involved and the states that actually conducted the election. Why does the Justice Department have that policy? So it's not accused of being a force for the federal government to adjudicate an election conducted by a state. But Bill Barr, the former Attorney General, said, I looked into these things, and this is what the testimony of the committee showed today. He said, because if I didn't, we might not have had a peaceful transition of our government. So he felt undue pressure from the President of the United States to look into these allegations, which the Justice Department historically hasn't done, but then having looked into all of them, repeatedly kept telling the President there's nothing there. He left. Right. His successor told the President the exact same thing. And even then, after all of these people with his own Justice Department, Trump loyalists all, telling him this wasn't true, he said, why don't we seize the election machines? Mm-hmm. That is as compelling a testimony has ever been heard on this subject about the 2020 election and what lengths President Trump considered going to remain in power.
And I think an important point that you point out is that these are people who were very loyal to President Trump at that period of time who are testifying now. Catherine, January 3rd was a key day leading up to the insurrection at the Capitol. Can you take us through what happened, how this is integral to the committee's investigation going forward?
Well, one of the things that has really jumped out to me, Jamie, especially listening to Major's analysis, is that when you have President Trump in the Oval Office asking whether they can seize the voting machines by Homeland Security, it refreshed my memory about some documents that we obtained here at CBS News about a couple of months ago that showed in mid-December this sort of separate team of outside advisors to President Trump had exchanged emails about drafting an order to do just that, to seize the voting machines by Homeland Security, with the idea that the Director of National Intelligence would analyze the voting machines to see if there had been systemic fraud in the voting process. So if you just bear with me a minute, what we have here with the testimony today is that we have President Trump talking to his top legal advisors and officials within the Justice Department about a plan to seize the voting machines by Homeland Security. But we know also from our reporting at CBS News and the documents that we obtained that there was this sort of second outside track of informal advisors who had suggested that to the president. So it has that feel of taking that proposition from the outside team and putting it forward to his official team to see if this is something that they could pursue. It's important to emphasize that at the end of the day, President Trump decided against this course of action, and he decided against taking Jeffrey Clark, who was the author of this memo, and putting him at the head of the Department of Justice heading into that critical period in January.
Well, that's that critical period you're talking about, which was based on my original question with January 3rd. There was a pretty dramatic meeting in the Oval Office that took place. Can you describe that for us?
Well, what we heard from the testimony today, and then also reviewing earlier depositions, is that President Trump was in the Oval Office. He was seated behind that wooden desk, which is known as the Resolute desk. It's such a symbol of the American presidency and authority and our democratic values. And he invited the top officials from the Justice Department and his White House legal team to debate whether the Justice Department had a reasonable basis to intervene in the election results for the presidential contest. One of my contacts who was at the Justice Department at that time said that the principals went into the meeting thinking that it wouldn't take more than a few minutes, but then it lasted several hours, as we heard in the testimony today. And they described it to me as kind of a showdown, and Democratic principles hung in the balance, Jamie.
Wow. Major, you know, Nikole, at the end of her story tonight, talked about several Republican members asking for pardons after January the 6th. To many, that was shocking information. Can you take us through what this means and moving forward in the investigation itself?
So the committee, through its depositions and emails and other evidence, established today that there were requests, specific requests from members of Congress, either for blanket pardons or specific pardons. Now, some of those Republicans have said, well, there were fears that after the uprising, the storming of the Capitol on January 6th, that the Biden Justice Department might unfairly prosecute them or make up crimes or things that they did. And they wanted to alert the president that they were fearful of this, and they sought a pardon to protect themselves, in their words, not mine, from a run-amok Biden Justice Department. But it's also worth considering that if you're asking the president so soon after the storming of the Capitol on January 6th and your visible and evidentiary support of everything that led up to it, you might think you're exposed to possible federal crimes prosecution. And the best way, the absolute best way to protect yourself from that possible eventuality is to ask the sitting president, as he's heading out the door, to grant you a pardon. A blanket pardon, if possible, to cover all federal crimes bases. And that's the suggestion that the Select Committee has put before the American public. Why would you ask the president a pardon if everything you did, you believe, was consistent with the law and Constitution? That there was doubt about that suggests they harbored reservations about their very own conduct.
Well, there's also some questions about Representative Matt Gaetz in this situation as well. When you say that he asked for a blanket pardon, we at CBS News have done reporting that there are other open investigations when it comes to the representative.
Absolutely true.
Yeah. Catherine, the January 6th criminal probe is expanding. We've been talking about these raids, you know, with other members. What else can you tell us about this that you've learned?
Well, we've been able to confirm here at CBS News in Washington that a handful of subpoenas have been served, Jamie, to these electors, these individuals who are willing to be on the slate as Trump electors. So what that tells me, based on the 2 decades that I've worked in this area, is that the investigation has expanded. We've got this raid we talked about earlier at the home of Jeffrey Clark in Northern Virginia. Very unusual. It's a former Justice Department individual, and also unusual in the sense that you execute a pre-dawn raid when you're concerned about the destruction of evidence, typically, or that the individual will not hand it over. And so it's an extreme step to begin with, but then to take that step with someone who served in the Justice Department. Based on my reporting, and it's somewhat anecdotal, talking to people who are familiar with this investigation, their view is that it's much easier for the Justice Department to build and bring a case against individuals who supported the idea of these Trump electors, or the fake or the alternate electors. And regardless of what the evidence and some of the testimony may be, ultimately bringing a criminal case against a former president has evidentiary challenges, but then it also has significant political challenges and ramifications as well. So this is all part of the equation.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Major, this is the last public hearing until July. The committee has said that they want to go over new evidence. What more can you tell us about the new information they've found?
Well, the committee has said through its chairman, Betty Thompson, that lots of people have offered tips and suggestions after watching these hearings. That's one evidentiary path that the committee wants to go down, basically follow what's coming on the tip line. There's a documentary film that was shot with lots and lots of hours of interviews with all the principals involved, Trump family, President Trump, former Vice President Pence. The committee is reviewing all of that raw footage to see if there's anything there that is of significance. And today, the committee said something it had never said before, that it had conducted informal interviews with former White House counsel Pat Cipollone. The committee said, through Adam Kinzinger, the Republican from Illinois on the panel, that this had been an informal conversation that had given the committee valuable information and insight, but they're still hoping to obtain a on-the-record interview with the former White House counsel, probably under oath, videotaped, and certainly recorded and transcribed. And that, Jamie, would be a very important voice to have, because as was indicated today by the Justice Department officials who pushed back at every single attempt President Trump made to pressure them to do something that didn't fit with the facts, the law, and the evidence, Pat Cipollone, White House counsel, was backing them up every step of the way. The committee would like to hear that in the former White House counsel's own words and perspective.
Yeah, they will. Fascinating to watch. Really appreciate both of you for your reporting. Major Garrett and Catherine Herridge, thanks for being with us.
Sure.